I thought my son's betrayal was the worst pain I'd ever feel. Until I learned he'd stolen not just my money, but my dignity. When he dragged me to court, I vowed I'd make him see what a mother's revenge really looks like. Stay with me till the end. You won't believe how justice found its way back home. My name is Evelyn. I'm 61 years old, a retired architect, and for most of my life, I believed my family was my greatest masterpiece. My husband, Robert, built our fortune brick by brick, and I helped design every home, every building, every legacy we left behind. But when Robert died, everything I'd ever built began to crumble. The day of the funeral, my son Michael stood beside the mahogany casket like a stranger in an expensive suit. His wife Sophie held his arm tightly, whispering things into his ear while I greeted the guests. I caught the coldness in her eyes, the kind that hides behind a polite smile. After the ceremony, Michael asked to speak to me privately. "Mom," he began, "Dad's will leaves you the house, but the business, I think we should transfer management to me." His tone wasn't asking. It was declaring. I felt my chest tighten. "Your father wanted me to oversee it until you were ready." "You're not there yet, Michael." Sophie smiled faintly, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Evelyn, don't you think it's time to let the next generation take over?" That was the moment I realized I was outnumbered. In the months that followed, they slowly isolated me. Michael took over meetings I was supposed to attend, ignored my advice, and gradually turned employees against me. Even my closest assistant, Linda, began to distance herself. I told myself it was grief that made them cold. But grief doesn't forge signatures. One morning, I went to the company's main branch to find my office door locked. My nameplate was gone. When I confronted the receptionist, she said softly, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Chambers. Mr. Chambers said you've retired." Retired, without my knowledge. That night, I found a letter on my desk, notarized, confirming my voluntary resignation. My hands trembled as I saw my own forged signature. Michael's work. I rushed to his house, furious. Sophie answered the door, wearing a silk robe and holding a glass of champagne. "Evelyn," she said coolly, "you shouldn't drive this late." "Where's my son?" I demanded. She leaned against the doorframe. "He's busy. Look, maybe it's better if you let him handle things now. You're tired. Emotional. It's time to rest." Her voice was velvet with poison. When Michael finally appeared, he didn't meet my eyes. "Mom, you taught me to be strong. I'm just doing what Dad would have wanted. Keeping the company alive." "You're destroying it," I said quietly. "And you're destroying us." He looked away. "It's business, Mom. Nothing personal." Those words haunted me. Nothing personal. Weeks later, my bank account was frozen. The company shares. Gone, every legal right I had stripped away. And then came the final insult, a lawsuit. Michael was suing me for mismanagement of funds. When I read the papers, my vision blurred. My own son, the boy I'd held through fevers, the man I'd defended through every mistake, was now accusing me of stealing from the empire I'd helped build. At the first court hearing, Sophie arrived in a pearl-white suit, her hair pulled into a perfect chignon. She didn't look at me once. Michael sat beside her, his hand resting on hers. My heart cracked at the sight. But I refused to crumble. I hired a discreet attorney, someone Robert once trusted. Quietly, I began gathering every document, every record, every forgotten file Robert had kept locked in his study. And that's when I found it. Tucked beneath an old blueprint was an envelope marked, "For Evelyn. Only if Michael fails you." My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were notarized ownership papers. Every share, every right, every piece of the company transferred fully to my name. Robert had never trusted Michael completely. He had left me the ultimate safeguard. I smiled through my tears. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt his presence again. The next morning, I walked into that courtroom no longer as a victim, but as a storm about to break. When I entered the courtroom that morning, I could feel every whisper, every eye tracking me. The woman they'd painted as a greedy, senile widow had finally shown up, and I made sure they saw what power looked like when it refused to die. I wore Robert's favorite navy suit and a string of pearls he'd given me for our 30th anniversary. Calm, unbroken. Michael and Sophie sat across the room with their attorney, whispering and smirking. He avoided my gaze, but Sophie didn't. Her eyes met mine, cool, polished, confident. I recognized that kind of woman. I'd once been her. But she'd made one mistake. She thought I was finished. The judge entered, and the air shifted. My attorney leaned toward me, whispering, "Stay silent today." Let them talk first, so I did. Michael took the stand and began his performance. He spoke of concern for his mother's declining judgment, of funds being redirected, of protecting the company his father built. His tone trembled just enough to sound sincere. People in the courtroom nodded. Even the judge seemed sympathetic. When it was my turn to respond, my attorney rose calmly. Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to submit new evidence. He handed the clerk a sealed envelope, the one Robert had left for me. Michael's head snapped toward me. Sophie's confident smile faltered. The judge unfolded the documents. These indicate sole ownership of Chambers' architecture and design to Mrs. Evelyn Chambers, signed and witnessed before the late Mr. Robert Chambers' death. The silence in that courtroom was delicious. Michael stammered, That can't be right. Dad and we discussed. The judge interrupted. The documents are valid. You've filed a claim against your mother for mismanagement of funds belonging to a company she legally owns in full. Would you like to revise your statement, Mr. Chambers? Sophie's face drained of color. I watched her fingers dig into Michael's arm beneath the table. My heart beat steady, slow. I didn't look at either of them. I simply folded my hands and waited. That day, the court adjourned early. My attorney advised me not to gloat, but I didn't need to. The power shift was already complete. Michael avoided me as they left the courtroom, but Sophie lingered behind, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She stopped close enough that I could smell her perfume, sharp, citrusy, expensive. You think you've won, she whispered. I smiled faintly. Oh, darling, I haven't even started. When she turned to leave, I caught her reflection in the glass door, a flicker of fear breaking through her poise. It was the first honest emotion I'd ever seen on her face. Over the next few days, I rebuilt my control quietly. The company board, once leaning toward Michael, began reaching out to me again. Reporters called for statements, and though I declined most interviews, I gave one to a trusted magazine, about the resilience of women who refuse to be erased. It wasn't revenge yet. It was groundwork. But revenge has its own rhythm. It comes in waves, subtle at first. 2 weeks later, I learned that Sophie had transferred $1.2 million from a dormant project account. The same account my attorney had flagged during the case. That's when I realized Michael wasn't the only betrayer in my family. I called an emergency board meeting and arrived early. As I waited, I glanced through the tall glass windows overlooking the city skyline Robert had once dreamed of reshaping. He used to tell me, every structure starts with trust. Lose that, and it collapses from within. He was right. When Michael and Sophie walked in, the tension was thick enough to taste. The boardroom, usually filled with polite chatter, was silent. I stood holding a folder of documents. Before we begin, I said evenly, I'd like to address something critical. I slid the folder across the table. A financial transfer, unauthorized, from project account 17B. The signature belongs to you, Sophie. Her eyes flickered. That's absurd. I pressed the remote, projecting her digital authorization on the screen. Time-stamped, recorded, undeniable. Gasps echoed around the table. Michael turned to her, his voice trembling. You told me. She cut him off sharply. Don't you dare. But it was too late. Their alliance cracked right there in front of everyone. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I simply said, security will escort you both out until a full audit is complete. When the guard stepped forward, Michael's face turned red. Mom, please, you can't. I can, I said softly, and I just did. He froze, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't recognize the woman standing before him. You're destroying our family. I met his gaze coldly. No, Michael, you did that when you chose greed over loyalty. As they left, the board members avoided eye contact. The door shut behind them, and I finally exhaled. The silence felt cleaner now, the kind of silence that comes after a storm. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window overlooking the city. Lights shimmered like tiny promises. For the first time in months, I felt peace. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over, because I'd seen the way Sophie looked at me as security led her out. Not defeated, not broken, but calculating. And I knew a woman like her never disappears quietly. As I closed the blinds and turned off the light, I caught my reflection in the glass. My face looked older, yes, but stronger too. Robert used to say I had a lion's patience. Maybe he was right, because I wasn't done hunting yet. 3 weeks after I removed Michael and Sophie from the company, the house grew too quiet. I'd thought peace would feel like victory, but instead it felt hollow. Every morning, I'd walk past Robert's portrait in the hallway and whisper, "We're safe now." But some nights, when the wind rattled the windows, I could almost hear him say, "Not yet, Evelyn." One evening, my attorney called. "Mrs. Chambers, I think you should see this." He sent me a file. A new lawsuit, filed not by Michael this time but by Sophie. She was suing me personally for emotional distress, defamation, and wrongful termination. A slow, bitter laugh escaped me. So this was her next move. The following morning, the media caught wind of it. Headlines read, "Evelyn Chambers faces legal retaliation from former daughter-in-law." My phone buzzed with calls, reporters at the gate, microphones shoved at my driver's window. Michael stayed silent. That was the cruelest part. I kept waiting for him to reach out, to say, "Mom, I didn't know she'd do this." But days turned into weeks, and nothing came. I realized Sophie still had her hooks in him. Then one night, as I scrolled through news coverage, I saw a photograph that stopped my breath. Michael and Sophie attending a gala, smiling hand in hand. The caption read, "Power couple returns to the scene." Power couple. That's what they were calling them now. The same pair who tried to strip me of everything. I stared at that image until anger tasted like iron on my tongue. I called my attorney again. "I want to countersue," I said. He hesitated. "On what grounds?" "Embezzlement, defamation." "Pick one," I replied coldly. She's about to learn what it feels like to start a war with someone who's already lost everything. Over the next few weeks, I rebuilt my alliances quietly, the way Robert would have done. I called old partners, architects, and clients Sophie had alienated. I invited them to dinner. Candlelight, crystal glasses, old charm, and I reminded them who I was, the real face behind the empire. Word spread quickly. Invitations that used to go to Sophie began arriving in my inbox again. A few board members resigned quietly from Michael's shadow company, the one he'd tried to start behind my back. One evening, as I sat in my study surrounded by files, Linda, my old assistant, knocked softly. "Mrs. Chambers, I think you should see this," she said, sliding an envelope across the desk. Inside was a USB drive. "What's this?" I asked. She hesitated. "Something I copied before I left the company. Sophie's been laundering small amounts through shell accounts under Michael's name. I couldn't prove it then, but I think it's enough now." My fingers tightened around the drive. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because I saw what they did to you," she said quietly. "And I couldn't watch anymore." That night, I barely slept. I watched the files play out on my laptop. Transactions, fake invoices, coded messages. Sophie had been draining money through offshore accounts for over a year. And Michael. He'd signed every approval she'd slipped under his nose. By morning, I had everything I needed. But revenge wasn't about rage anymore. It was about precision. I waited 2 days before calling Sophie directly. When she answered, her voice was syrupy sweet. "Evelyn, how lovely to hear from you. I was beginning to think you'd gone into hiding." "I don't hide," I said softly. "But I do watch." She laughed lightly. "You sound nervous." "I'm not nervous, dear. I'm patient. And I think your patience is about to be tested." There was a pause on the line. I could hear her inhale sharply. "What are you talking about?" "You'll see soon enough," I replied and hung up. The following morning, my attorney filed a criminal complaint against both Sophie and Michael. Fraud, embezzlement, wire transfers. It was airtight. Within hours, their accounts were frozen, their reputations shattered. The press turned fast. Power couple faces fraud allegations. I watched the headlines roll across the television screen, sipping my coffee slowly, savoring every word. That evening, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, Michael stood there. He looked older, exhausted, his eyes bloodshot. "Mom, please," he said, voice breaking. "You have to drop this. Sophie didn't mean." I cut him off. "Don't you dare defend her. She knew exactly what she was doing, and so did you." He ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't, I swear. She told me you were trying to take everything for yourself. And you believed her," I said flatly. He looked at me, desperate. "I was angry, Mom. After Dad died, I didn't know who to trust." "You could have trusted me," I whispered. Tears filled his eyes. "I'm sorry." The apology hit me like a ghost. "Too late, too faint to matter." I turned away. "Go home, Michael." "I don't have one," he said quietly. "They've seized everything." I froze. For a moment, my mother's heart wavered. Then I thought of the night he'd called me incompetent, the morning I'd found my office door locked, the courtroom where he'd looked at me like a stranger. And I hardened again. "You made your choices," I said, my voice low. "Now live with them." He flinched. I closed the door gently, not slamming it, because revenge isn't loud, it's final. When the latch clicked, I stood there for a long time, breathing in the silence. My heart ached, but it was a clean ache. The kind that tells you you've survived something meant to destroy you. Outside, rain began to fall, slow, steady, cleansing. As lightning flashed across the sky, I whispered to Robert's memory, "It's done. He knows what it feels like to lose everything he took for granted." But in the corner of my mind, a shadow lingered. Sophie wasn't the kind of woman to accept defeat. I'd burned her bridges. But women like her didn't walk away. They rebuilt, sharper than before. Weeks passed after Michael's desperate visit, but I couldn't shake the unease settling in my bones. Revenge should have felt like closure, yet the silence afterward was unsettling. Too still, too deliberate. I'd lived long enough to know when an enemy was planning their next move. Sophie had disappeared from the public eye after the fraud allegations broke. Her social accounts went dark. The press speculated she'd fled abroad, but I knew better. Sophie wasn't the type to vanish, she was the type to reappear stronger. I kept my routine tight. Morning walks through the garden Robert had planted, evening wine on the terrace overlooking the city. But every time my phone rang, I half expected her voice on the other end. Then one morning, Linda came rushing into my study, breathless. "Mrs. Chambers," she said, holding a folder, "you need to see this." Inside were glossy magazine clippings and an online press release. Sophie Hartman launches new architecture firm, Viridian Designs. My pulse quickened as I read. The company's listed co-founder Michael Chambers. So that was her move. She'd used his desperation, his guilt, and built a new empire on the ruins of mine. The press hailed it as a phoenix story. How a betrayed son and his resilient wife had risen above, family scandal, to start fresh. I could almost hear Sophie's voice in those headlines. Linda watched me carefully. "What will you do?" I closed the folder slowly. What I should have done from the start. Remind them who taught them everything they know. That evening, I drove to my late husband's old office, the original Chambers headquarters, long closed but still under my ownership. Dust coated the furniture, but the walls still breathed his legacy. I turned on the lights and stared at the blueprint of our first design. The building that started it all. Robert had once told me, architecture isn't just about what you build. It's about what lasts when you're gone. I smiled faintly. "Let's build one more thing together, darling," I whispered. The next morning, I called a quiet meeting with my top former architects, the ones who had stayed loyal. Some were hesitant. The drama had tainted the Chambers name. But when I laid out my plan, their skepticism turned to awe. "We're launching something new," I said. "Something timeless, sustainable, and honest. We're taking back the skyline." I named it Aurora Designs, a symbol of rebirth. But unlike Sophie's flashy launch, I didn't announce it with champagne or cameras. I let my work speak. Within months, Aurora's designs began appearing on cover spreads. Modern, elegant, purposeful. The industry buzz at Evelyn Chambers is back. Then, as if on cue, Sophie tried to outdo me. She announced a massive project, a luxury skyscraper in downtown Chicago, supposedly her firm's magnum opus. But something about her proposal caught my attention. The location, the permits, the investors, all too familiar. I asked my legal advisor to investigate quietly. What he found confirmed my suspicion. She'd used stolen designs, mine, blueprints from projects I'd drafted years ago, buried in old archives. She'd modified them, claimed them as her own. For a moment, anger flooded me. Hot, sharp, consuming. But then I smiled. She'd just given me the perfect weapon. I waited until the night before her grand unveiling. The event was everywhere. Journalists, investors, influencers. Sophie was about to present her stolen dream to the world. That evening I dressed carefully. A charcoal silk gown, diamond earrings, hair swept up elegantly. Power has a look, and I made sure I wore it well. When I arrived at the venue, the guards hesitated. "Mom, this event is invitation only." I met the young man's eyes and smiled. "Sweetheart, the invitation was written years ago when I created those blueprints." He blinked, unsure, but stepped aside. Inside, the room glittered with money and arrogance. Sophie stood on stage in a white dress, every inch the triumphant designer. Michael sat in the front row, clapping as photographers flashed. She began her speech, confident, polished. Viridian Designs represents innovation and vision. And theft, I said, my voice cutting through the room like glass. Every head turned. I walked toward the stage, slow and steady, heels clicking in perfect rhythm. Sophie froze mid-sentence, color draining from her face. I reached the podium, handed the announcer a USB drive, and said, "Play this, please." The screen behind her flickered to life. My original designs, complete with dated drafts, signatures, and metadata proving ownership. Gasps rippled through the audience. "This," I said clearly, "is the true origin of the vision you're celebrating tonight." Sophie's mask cracked. "You can't prove." "Oh, I can," I said. "And the legal claim is already filed. You'll be hearing from my attorney tomorrow." Reporters swarmed instantly. Cameras flashed. Investors whispered. Michael stood slowly, his face ashen. "Mom," he murmured. I didn't even look at him. My eyes were on her. "You wanted to build your empire on lies, Sophie, but you forgot one thing. I'm the foundation you can't erase." I turned and walked out as the room descended into chaos behind me. By morning, every news outlet had the story. Viridian Designs accused of intellectual property theft. Sophie's reputation disintegrated overnight. Investors pulled out, her accounts were frozen, and within weeks, the company collapsed. Michael called once, twice, 3 times. I didn't answer. But one evening, I found an envelope on my doorstep. Inside was a handwritten note. "Mom, I lost everything again. She's gone. I don't expect forgiveness, but I understand now what I did to you. You were right. Greed builds nothing. Michael." I sat there for a long time, staring at his words. The anger inside me didn't flare this time. It just softened. Maybe revenge had taken enough. I placed the letter inside Robert's old journal and whispered, "You'd be proud of me, love. I protected what we built." But I also learned when to stop. That night, I went out to the garden. The moonlight spilled over the roses Robert had planted decades ago. For the first time in years, I didn't feel haunted. I felt whole. The wind rustled the leaves as if the universe was finally exhaling. And though I knew Sophie would probably try to claw her way back into society, I also knew something she didn't. Reputation can be rebuilt, but trust, once broken, never truly returns. As I walked back inside, I caught my reflection in the window. Not a victim, not even a victor. Just a woman who survived betrayal and turned it into strength. And that, I realized, was the real revenge. And somehow, I knew she'd be back. Months passed after Sophie's empire crumbled. The headlines faded, the gossip quieted, and the city finally stopped whispering my name. I'd won, but victory didn't feel like celebration. It felt like silence, a deep, echoing silence that settled in the walls of my mansion like dust. Every morning, I'd walk through the marble halls, hearing my own footsteps where laughter once lived. Robert's portrait hung in the foyer, his eyes steady as ever. Sometimes I caught myself talking to him. "We did it," I'd whisper. "We protected what we built." But deep inside, I knew the truth. I hadn't just protected it. I'd scorched the earth to save it. Aurora Designs was thriving now. Clients trusted me again. The new headquarters gleamed with glass and light, and every project carried my signature precision. But success doesn't hold you at night. It doesn't replace the sound of your child's voice. Michael hadn't reached out again after that final letter. I told myself I didn't care, that he'd made his choices. But on quiet evenings, I found myself rereading his note. The ink had bled slightly from my tears the first time I opened it. Linda noticed my restlessness. One afternoon, as we reviewed new proposals, she looked up and said softly, "You could forgive him, you know." I frowned. "Forgiveness doesn't undo betrayal." "No," she said gently, "but it unchains you from it." Her words lingered. I thought about them for days. Forgiveness. Was that even possible after everything he'd done? One Friday evening, as I was leaving the office, I saw a man standing by the lobby doors. His shoulders were hunched, his clothes wrinkled, his eyes hollow. It took me a moment to recognize him. Michael. He looked older, broken in ways pride couldn't hide. "Mom," he said softly. I stood still. "What are you doing here?" I didn't know where else to go. There was a tremor in his voice, one I hadn't heard since he was a boy. I wanted to turn away to guard myself, but something about his expression kept me there. He continued, "I lost the house. The investors froze my accounts. I've been trying to start over, but no one will hire me, not with my record. And Sophie?" I asked. He looked down. "Gone." She left the country right after the investigation started. I don't even know where. I studied him for a long moment. This wasn't the arrogant man who'd taken me to court. This was my son. The boy who used to run barefoot through Robert's garden, the one who once drew skyscrapers with crayons on my drafting paper. You did this to yourself, I said quietly. He nodded. I know I was stupid, angry, and she knew how to use that. I wanted to prove I could be like Dad, but instead I destroyed everything he left me. His voice cracked. I don't expect forgiveness, Mom. I just needed to say I'm sorry. The words hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, I saw Robert's face in his. Tired, remorseful human. I wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the fire that had fueled me for so long. But looking at him now, I realized revenge had already taken enough from me. I exhaled slowly. You hurt me, Michael. You took everything I loved and tried to make me small. He lowered his head. I know, and you almost succeeded. He looked up, tears in his eyes. Almost? Less, I said. Almost. I turned toward the window. Outside, the sunset painted the skyline in amber and gold. Robert would have loved that view. When I spoke again, my voice was quieter. You can't undo what you did, but maybe you can start again. Not as my son the Hare, but as a man who's learned what integrity costs. He nodded slowly. If you'll let me. I'm not the one who needs to let you, I said. You need to let yourself. He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket. I brought you something. He handed me a small, worn leather notebook. I opened it and froze. It was Robert's old sketchbook, the one I thought was lost years ago. Inside were faded pencil drawings of our first buildings, and on the last page, a note written in Robert's neat handwriting. If you're reading this, it means something has broken between you and the ones you love. Remember, Evelyn, our legacy isn't just buildings. It's forgiveness, too. The tears filled my eyes. I closed the book gently, afraid the words might disappear. When I looked up, Michael was still standing there, waiting, not demanding, not begging, just waiting. I took a deep breath. Come by tomorrow morning, I said finally. We'll talk about what comes next. He blinked, surprised. You mean? I mean I'm not promising anything, I interrupted. But maybe it's time to start rebuilding something that isn't made of concrete. A faint smile touched his lips, the first I'd seen in years. Thank you, Mom. As he left, I stayed by the window, clutching Robert's notebook to my chest. The city lights shimmered below, alive and bright, and for the first time, the view didn't feel lonely. The next morning, I set an extra cup at the breakfast table. It was strange how empty the mansion had felt before, and how one small gesture could change that. When Michael arrived, nervous but determined, I saw a flicker of the man he might have been if greed hadn't taken root. We spent the morning talking, not about the company, not about money, but about Robert, about the old days, about the laughter we used to share before everything fractured. For the first time in years, I felt something shift between us, not full trust, not yet, but something like the beginning of healing. Later that evening as he left, he turned at the door and said, I'll make it right, Mom, I promise. I nodded. Just make it honest. When the door closed, I walked through the house slowly, my fingers tracing the framed memories lining the walls. Robert's laughter echoed faintly in my mind. Maybe Linda had been right. Forgiveness didn't erase betrayal, but it set me free from it. I poured myself a glass of wine, stepped out to the balcony, and watched the city lights flicker like fireflies. Aurora Designs glowed in the distance, my name shining proudly across the skyline. But tonight, I didn't see it as a monument to victory. I saw it as a reminder that even the strongest structures can crumble, but what truly lasts is the courage to rebuild, and I finally allowed myself to breathe. Weeks turned into months again, but this time, the silence inside my house didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like calm. Michael started visiting every Sunday. At first, the conversations were cautious, filled with pauses and careful phrasing, but gradually they became real again. He'd tell me about his new job at a small design firm, how he was starting from the bottom, drafting, assisting, doing what he once thought was beneath him. I could see humility shaping him in ways success never had. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at Robert's portrait and smiling faintly. I think he missed him too, in ways words couldn't capture. Linda would join us occasionally, always bringing that easy warmth that seemed to mend whatever cracks were left. She once whispered to me as we cleared the dishes, See, he's learning. You both are. She was right. Forgiveness wasn't a single moment, it was a process, a slow unraveling of pain. I had spent years building walls so high I couldn't see the sky beyond them. Now, for the first time, I could. One rainy afternoon, Michael arrived with a small girl clutching his hand. His daughter. My granddaughter. She peeked at me from behind his leg, eyes wide, curls bouncing with every shy movement. "Mom," he said, smiling nervously, "this is Emily." I knelt down, my heart swelling. "Hello, sweetheart," I said softly. She looked at me for a long second, then reached out and handed me a crumpled drawing. 3 stick figures holding hands under a big yellow sun. I felt my throat tighten. "That's you," she said proudly, pointing at the tallest one. Tears stung my eyes. "It's beautiful, Emily." That night after they left, I hung her drawing beside Robert's sketchbook in my study. 2 different generations, 2 different kinds of art, both reminding me what mattered most wasn't legacy or reputation, but love that somehow survived the fire. When the board of Aurora Designs asked me to accept a Lifetime Achievement Award later that year, I hesitated. I'd spent decades building an empire, but now I understood. Recognition meant nothing without reconciliation. Still, I went. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and crystal glasses, the air filled with the scent of lilies and success. As I stood on stage, I saw familiar faces. Old colleagues, rivals, clients who had doubted me, and a few who had betrayed me. But among the crowd, one face stood out, Michael standing in the back, Emily on his shoulders, smiling proudly. When the applause quieted, I looked at the audience and began. "People think strength comes from what we build," I said. "From power, from control, from never bending. But true strength comes from learning when to bend, when to forgive, and when to start over." The room was silent, listening. I spent years believing revenge was justice. I thought if I burned everything that hurt me, I'd finally find peace. But I learned something. When you live for revenge, you live inside the ruins. When you forgive, you walk out of them. I glanced toward Michael. His eyes glistened, and for the first time in decades, I saw the boy I'd raised, not the man who'd betrayed me. "I'm not here because I was fearless," I continued. "I'm here because I was broken, and I chose to rebuild. Brick by brick, day by day. If you ever lose everything, remember that you can still begin again. You can still make beauty out of ashes." Applause filled the hall, but what mattered wasn't their praise. It was the peace settling in my chest. After the ceremony, as we walked out into the night, rain began to fall, soft and cleansing. Michael handed me his jacket, and Emily laughed as raindrops sparkled in her hair. I held her hand, small and warm in mine, and realized something profound. The same rain that once blurred my tears now washed away the past. That night, when I got home, I lit a candle in Robert's study. The city stretched before me, glittering and alive. Aurora Designs' logo glowed proudly in the skyline, but I didn't look at it with pride anymore. I looked at it with peace. I opened his sketchbook one last time and traced the words he'd written years ago. "Our legacy isn't just buildings, it's forgiveness." I smiled through tears. "You were right, Robert," I whispered. "You always were." The clock chimed softly in the background. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far away, but the air inside felt still and warm. I closed my eyes, letting memories drift through me. The laughter, the pain, the betrayal, the redemption, all of it. Maybe that's what life really is. Not one story, but 1,000 moments stitched together by the choices we make. And for the first time, I chose peace over pride. In the months that followed, I stepped down as CEO. I handed Aurora Designs to a new generation, not to Michael, but to the young designers who had stayed loyal when everything fell apart. I wanted them to build their own legacy, not live in the shadow of mine. I kept my home, though. I filled it with life again. Dinners, laughter, small moments that mattered more than any empire. Michael and Emily became my world, and in their laughter, I heard echoes of what I thought I'd lost forever. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace, Emily climbed into my lap and asked, "Grandma, are you happy now?" I smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, I think I finally am, even after everything," she asked innocently. "Especially after everything," I said. "Because that's how we know it was worth surviving." She grinned, resting her head on my shoulder, and I looked at the fire flickering before us. Its light danced across the room, warm and alive, not destructive, but healing, and I realized that maybe revenge had led me here for a reason, not to destroy, but to teach me how to rebuild from within. When I closed my eyes that night, I dreamt not of the courtroom or betrayal or loss. but of Robert's laughter, Michael's forgiveness, and Emily's little hands drawing suns that never set. The past no longer haunted me. It had become part of me. I was Evelyn Monroe, once broken, once betrayed, and now finally free. If you felt Evelyn's journey, her pain, and her redemption, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Every story on this channel reminds us that revenge might start with fire, but sometimes it ends in light. Stay with us for the next tale, where karma writes the final chapter.